These are the lecture notes for Chapter 5, the integumentary system, which includes your skin, your hair, your nails, and certain glands, such as the oil glands and sweat glands that are in your skin. So the integumentary system can also be referred to simply as the integument, and it includes the skin or cutaneous membrane and the accessory structures, which are hair, nails, and exocrine glands. The cutaneous membrane, or the skin, consists of two layers, and that is the most superficial layer, which is the top layer, the epidermis, and then the layer that underlies the epidermis is called the dermis. The epidermis is composed of epithelial tissue, and the dermis is composed of connective tissue. One layer is areolar connective tissue, and the layer below that is dense, irregular connective tissue. And then the subcutaneous layer or hypodermis is not technically considered skin, but we study it along with the integumentary system. It is composed of loose connective tissue. It underlies the dermis, and it separates the integument or skin from the deeper tissues like the muscles. This is a cross-section through skin all the way through from the epidermis down to the hypodermis, and we'll just look at the different parts. This layer here is the epidermis. The cells that still have a nucleus that are shaded kind of a light purple are living cells, and then the cells that are brown are dead and filled with keratin. The papillary layer of the dermis is the top layer, and it's composed of areolar tissue. The reticular layer comes below that, and it is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. And then you have your subcutaneous layer or hypodermis here. You can see hair, the hair shaft. You can see a pore of a sweat gland duct that is not connected to a hair shaft. You can see touch receptors. They're in the dermis, but this touch receptor is connected closely to the epidermis. Sebaceous glands, which are always associated with a hair follicle. The erector pili muscle, which contracts and causes you to have goosebumps, causes your hair to stand on end. A sweat gland duct. In the deeper part of the dermis, the hair follicle itself, a pressure receptor, which is in the reticular layer of the dermis, some nerve fibers, and sweat glands, and blood vessels. There are five main functions of the integumentary system. One, of course, is protection. The skin protects the underlying tissues and organs in your body and prevents fluid loss. Temperature maintenance. The skin is able to help maintain temperature by sweating or by the blood vessels constricting and holding in heat whenever you're cold. So it helps keep your temperature within a narrow range. Synthesizing and storing nutrients. Your epidermis actually synthesizes a vitamin D3, and this happens when you are exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And then adipose tissue is stored in the dermis, which is fat tissue. Sensory reception is another function of the skin, and that is the sensation of touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And this information is relayed to the central nervous system and the brain and the spinal cord. The skin functions in excretion and secretion. Excretion refers to sweat. So your sweat glands excrete water along with salts and organic waste. and then mammary glands secrete milk. The oil glands, called sebaceous glands, excrete oil or sebum. No, they secrete. I'm sorry, secrete. The sebaceous glands secrete oil because it's a product that's secreted. Excrete means to get rid of the waste, and then secrete means that it's being released, produced and released, for a purpose. It's not just waste that we're getting rid of. Okay, the epidermis is composed of layers of epithelial cells. We learned in the last chapter that this tissue is called stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The epidermis does not contain blood vessels. It's avascular. It relies on materials that it needs, and it relies on diffusion to take in nutrients and oxygen, and also to get rid of waste. The connective tissue supplies the connective tissue below the epidermis supplies the epidermis with nutrients and oxygen. So it obtains them by diffusing from the dermis. The deepest cells of the epidermis, the ones closest to the dermis, are most active. They're stem cells, and they are actively dividing to produce more epidermal cells to replace the ones that you shed. The superficial layers, or the outer layers of the epidermis, are dead and filled with keratin. And by this time, they're called keratinocytes. They're filled with the protein keratin. Thick and thin skin. Basically, all over your body you have skin, and most of it is thin skin. And thin skin contains 4 layers of cells. The thick skin contains an extra layer of cells, and also the stratum corneum, which is the most outer layer, the most superficial layer, is very thick. And then the thick skin also contains an extra layer called the stratum lucidum. So that gives it 5 layers of cells. And where you find thick skin is on your palms and your soles. These are the 5 layers of thick skin from deep to superficial. So this is actually backwards from how it really, like if you were looking from top to bottom. Your top layer of skin, or most superficial layer, is the stratum corneum. Then there's the stratum lucidum under that, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale, which has cells that are undergoing mitosis and dividing to replace the cells that are lost from the stratum corneum. You've got some definitions here, and here they're in order from the top down. The stratum corneum contains multiple layers of flattened, dead, interlocking keratinocytes, water resistant but not waterproof. The stratum lucidum appears as a glassy layer in thick skin only. The stratum granulosum consists of keratinocytes that are still producing keratin. They're not really dead yet. They are dying though. And the keratinocytes in stratum spinosum are bound together by desmosomes. And the stratum basale is the deepest layer, which is attached to the basement membrane, and it contains basal cells or stem cells, which are dividing to replace the epidermal cells that you lose, that you shed, melanocytes, which produce the pigment melanin, and then Merkel cells, which are touch receptors. The stratum basale is also referred to as the stratum germinativum, the stratum basale, or the stratum germinativum. It is attached to the basement membrane by hemidesmosomes. And if you'll remember, all epithelial tissue is attached to the basement membrane by hemidesmosomes. The basal cells or germinative cells are the stem cells that continually divide by mitosis to replace the cells that we shed. Merkel cells are touch receptors, and melanocytes produce the pigment melanin. The epidermal ridges are the basis for fingerprints, and those ridges are formed by the epidermis and the dermis interlocking and contacting each other. The dermal projections, called dermal papilla, extend upward into the epidermis, and the epidermis has ridges that extend downward. So the ridges in the papilla interlock. And what this does is folding, and anytime you see folding, that's usually for increasing the surface area between the two layers. And that's important because the epidermis receives its nutrients and oxygen from the dermis.